the beekeeping industry is in crisis over the shocking and unexplained deaths of hundreds of millions of bees over the last 8 months.
For years, Australia was the last safe haven for honeybees, until a parasite breached its shores. Oh, what followed wasn't just a biosecurity crisis. It was mass hive burnings, farmer protests, and a nation pushed to the brink.
You're not just killing the bees, you're killing yourself!
We hear a lot of professed concern from ministers that bees are important, but they're doing not enough about it.
But 1 year later, what emerged from the ashes was something no one expected. The fortress of bees. For decades, Australia was a sanctuary in a world crumbling under the weight of ecological collapse, while Europe, Asia, and the Americas watched in horror as their honeybee colonies crumbled year after year, ravaged by parasites, pesticides, and pollution. Australia stood firm. No Varroa mites, no colony collapsed on a national scale, just vast humming orchards pollinated by some of the healthiest bees on Earth. This wasn't luck. It was the result of fierce border control, rigorous biosecurity laws, and an island nation's relentless vigilance. Australian hives became scientific gold standards, untouched models of what healthy pollination ecosystems could look like. Almonds, blueberries, macadamias, orchards flourished. Entire industries thrived because the bees here were stronger, cleaner, and unburdened by the parasite, Varroa destructor, which was haunting the rest of the globe. To understand just how serious this was, consider what Varroa did elsewhere. In the United States, beekeepers watched 30 to 50% of their colonies vanish in a single season. In Italy and Greece, centuries-old beekeeping traditions were forced to adapt or die. The mites weren't just a threat to honey. They were a threat to food, to life. And yet, year after year, Australia held the line. But experts warned it couldn't last. A single breach, a stowaway mite slipping in through a shipping container, a rogue swarm near a port, could unleash the very collapse Australia had long delayed. It was a biological time bomb, and that bomb finally went off in June 2022. What followed was not just a scientific emergency, it was a national reckoning. The breach at Newcastle. It was just another routine inspection at the port of Newcastle, Australia's second-largest seaport and a key artery for agricultural exports. Inspectors opened a hive near the shipping terminal, expecting the usual check. What they found instead would trigger one of the most aggressive biosecurity responses in the country's history. A reddish-brown mite, barely the size of a grain of sand, clung to the body of a European honeybee. It was Varroa destructor, the world's most devastating parasite of honeybees, and it had breached the final stronghold. Within hours, a 10-kilometer eradication zone was declared. Beekeepers in the region were issued urgent orders: halt all hive movement, destroy any colonies testing positive for the mite, and begin mass surveillance. Hive logs were traced, GPS data cross-referenced. Biosecurity teams moved in, suited up like hazmat responders, examining brood frames, euthanizing infected colonies, and sterilizing equipment. It was a race against biology. The public was warned, emergency briefings aired on national television. Local beekeepers, many of them hobbyists or small operators, watched in disbelief as trucks rolled in to torch their life's work, sometimes with little more than a few hours' notice. Officials hoped it was a localized breach, a fluke. Maybe it hadn't spread far. But deep down, many knew the truth. Newcastle wasn't an isolated hive. It was a commercial port. Shipments had moved, bees had likely swarmed. Some colonies had already been sold or relocated. The mite had slipped through the cracks, maybe weeks earlier, and Australia's firewall had just failed. The scorched defense. At first, the response was swift, clinical, and ruthless. Australia had rehearsed for this. Contingency plans were dusted off. Biosecurity crews expanded the red zones. Swarms were tracked like fugitives. Entire apiaries, sometimes containing hundreds of healthy hives, were euthanized in a single sweep. Beekeepers watched in silent grief as their bees were doused in petrol and set alight. By mid-2023, The eradication campaign had destroyed over 14,000 hives. The cost ballooned to more than 130 million Australian dollars, making it one of the most expensive pest control efforts in national history. But the cost wasn't just financial. In rural towns across New South Wales, the pain ran deeper. Families who had kept bees for generations were suddenly told they had to kill everything they'd built. Insurance didn't cover it. Compensation was slow. Protests flared, especially among small-scale operators. Some refused to comply. Others wept as officials in biohazard suits arrived unannounced with orders to burn. Even for those who followed the rules, the emotional toll was immense. Beekeeping isn't just a business, it's a culture, a way of life. For many, it was their identity. The sudden loss created a wave of anxiety and depression that swept through rural communities already stretched thin by drought and economic uncertainty. And through it all, the mites kept moving. Despite the containment zones, surveillance drones, and rigorous checkpoints, new infections surfaced far from Newcastle. The maps bled red. Infection sites appeared without clear links to previous cases, suggesting wild swarms or undetected hives had become vectors. Varroa was slipping past every line of defense. The eradication effort, once hopeful, was now visibly cracking. Each new detection felt like a death knell. Behind closed doors, scientists and officials began whispering the unthinkable. What if it was already too late? When the map turned red. By late 2022, the illusion of control had shattered. The Department of Primary Industries released updated maps showing how far the mite had spread. And it was worse than anyone expected. Red blotches, once confined to coastal pockets around Newcastle, now reached inland agricultural corridors. Isolated detections began appearing with no known connection to previous sites, suggesting one terrifying truth. The Varroa mite had gone feral. Feral colonies, wild, unmanaged swarms hiding in tree hollows, rooftops, and outbuildings, became invisible carriers. They couldn't be traced. They couldn't be treated. And they moved freely across forests, farms, and urban spaces. Varroa had breached not just managed hives, but the wild bee population itself. With each new outbreak, the biosecurity strategy grew more chaotic. Some beekeepers began splitting and selling hives out of fear they'd be euthanized anyway. Others stopped reporting mite sightings entirely. Compliance broke down. Trust in the system evaporated. And it wasn't just beekeepers who felt the pressure. Farmers watched nervously as pollination contracts unraveled. The 2023 almond season, which required tens of thousands of hives, teetered on the edge of collapse. Crops bloomed with no bees to service them. Inside the labs, entomologists began writing off eradication as impossible. Outside, families stood in fields where their bees once foraged, now empty and silent. What was once a tightly coordinated national response had turned into scattered damage control. Surveillance teams were overwhelmed. Movement zones were meaningless. And in September 2023, the government finally said it aloud. Australia was abandoning eradication. The ashes of silence. The announcement came quietly, but it hit like thunder. In September 2023, New South Wales authorities declared what many had already accepted behind closed doors. The war was over. Australia would no longer pursue eradication of the Varroa mite. From now on, the only path forward was management. It was the end of an era, one where Australia held the proud title of the last Varroa-free continent. That illusion was gone, replaced by a harsher, more complex reality. The country would now have to do what the rest of the world had been forced to do years earlier: learn to live with the enemy. This wasn't just a policy shift. It was a cultural rupture. Beekeepers were told they needed to adopt integrated pest management, IPM, a set of monitoring and control techniques that most Australians had never needed. Webinars were launched, training manuals distributed. Researchers scrambled to translate years of global Varroa data into something relevant for Australian hives. Chemical miticides, once unnecessary, were introduced under strict regulation. Beekeepers now had to inspect brood frames, count mites, document treatments, and rotate compounds to avoid resistance. For commercial operators, this meant a complete overhaul of business as usual. For hobbyists, it was often too much. Thousands quit the practice altogether, unable or unwilling to adapt. Backyard hives disappeared. Regional beekeeping clubs dissolved. It wasn't just a biological invasion. It was a social one. But even in the grief and confusion, something else was stirring. Because as Australians began to manage the mite, some bees began to fight back. The mutiny in the hive. Not all hives went quietly. In the months following the shift to management, a few observant beekeepers began noticing strange behavior in certain colonies. Bees were grooming each other more aggressively, scraping and biting at mites latched onto their sisters. Some workers were even removing infested brood cells before the mites could reproduce. These weren't accidents, they were survival instincts. Researchers confirmed the signs of Varroa-sensitive hygiene, VSH, and grooming behavior, two traits that had taken decades to develop in other countries through selective breeding. But here they were, already emerging in pockets of the Australian population. It was a glimmer of hope. Queen breeders took note. Colonies that survived longer with lower mite loads were isolated and studied. Queens from these hives were grafted, propagated, and distributed to other regions. The goal was no longer eradication, but resilience. Australia, it seemed, wasn't just absorbing global Varroa management strategies. It was creating its own response, one that leaned into the genetic adaptability of the bees themselves. And surprisingly, they weren't alone. While honeybee numbers dipped, farmers began looking to native Australian bees for pollination backup. These species, immune to Varroa, stepped into the void, giving the ecosystem a chance to rebalance. The bees weren't beaten yet. Sanctuaries in the sky. While the countryside smoldered with hive pyres and abandoned apiaries, a quieter revolution was unfolding in the cities and labs. In research centers across Australia, scientists teamed up with European collaborators to trial something radical: probiotic blends tailored to enhance honeybee immunity. These formulas, designed to boost resistance to Varroa-transmitted viruses like deformed wing virus, entered field testing in mid-2024. Early results were promising. Colonies in high-pressure zones showed higher survival rates, fewer deformities, and stronger foraging activity. At the same time, urban beekeeping exploded. In cities like Sydney and Melbourne, where hives were once novelty features on rooftop gardens, beekeepers reported something astonishing. Their colonies weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Free from agricultural pesticide drift and surrounded by diverse urban flora, these bees became unexpectedly strongholds in the fight for adaptation. And they were no longer fringe. These urban hives were now being integrated into queen breeding programs, feeding genetic material into national efforts to develop more resilient bee lines. Innovation wasn't just happening in high-tech labs. It was taking root above cafes, on balconies, and in community gardens. In a twist no one saw coming, the cities had become sanctuaries. The battle for Australia's bees wasn't over, but the front lines had changed. Blueprint for a new hive. By mid-2025, Australia's battle with Varroa destructor has become something more than a fight for survival. It's become a blueprint for resilience. In places like Victoria and Queensland, beekeepers now log hive health, treatment cycles, and mite infestations through real-time tracking apps, feeding a live national database that lets scientists detect patterns and forecast outbreaks before they explode. It's no longer just about reacting, it's about anticipating. What began as a tactical defeat has sparked a strategic awakening. Across the country, the response has evolved, from lab-grown probiotics that fortify bees against viral threats, to the rise of native pollinators stepping in where honeybees falter. Rooftop hives, once novelties, now contribute genetic stock for a new generation of mite-resistant queens. Genomic breeding, citizen science, and backyard beekeeping have merged into a decentralized, adaptive defense. Australia is no longer the last untouched haven. That era is over. But in its place, a new identity is emerging, not of isolation, but of innovation. This isn't the end of the story. It's the start of a new frontier. One where survival is no longer just about keeping the mites out, but about evolving faster than they can spread. Australia may have lost its fortress, but what it built in its place could change everything. From urban sanctuaries to genetically resilient bees, the future is buzzing with innovation. If this story surprised you, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter in this bee battle is just beginning.